the biggest decision of his life. What kind of Messiah to be? The temptations, food, wealth, glory, hint that Jesus was being tempted by the trappings of power.
I think there was the temptation there to lead a military or a very powerful political move. But then he realized what he had seen as a young boy, the burning of Sepphoris. He realized that those who live by the sword are going to die by the sword. Luke says he would often spend all night in prayer. Mark says he would get up very early, long before dawn, and go out and meditate in prayer and think. So we have a human. Let's not forget the humanness of Jesus. I think he's trying to find out, what am I to do?
His decision would have fateful consequences. His words and actions galvanized large crowds who saw him as their long-awaited savior. But they would also put Jesus on a collision course with death. Jesus of Nazareth was said to have wondrous healing powers. Yet he was also accused of consorting with thieves, prostitutes, and tax collectors. Now history and archaeology are painting a clearer picture of where he lived, who he was, what he did, and why he was seen as a threat. Jerusalem today is a place where religious and political tensions are never far from the surface. This is the Wailing Wall. It is one of the holiest sites in Judaism. It's where Jews come to pray. Many pray for the freedom to live in a land that is theirs alone. Historians now realize that 2,000 years ago, the Jews here also dreamt of freedom.
In the time of Jesus, they are losing the land. They are losing it not only to the might of Rome, but they're losing it by taxation from the Caesars who are demanding more and more. So you have an oppressed people. You have a people that are losing hope. You have people that are turning more and more to believing that God must soon do something.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, written in the 2nd century BC, reveal what the Jews believed. That sooner or later, God would send a Messiah, a Savior. By the time of Jesus, and Jesus was a Jew, Jewish hopes had reached fever pitch.
Religion is in the air, like in a big football game, in London or in Manchester. The frenzy that's going on, that's Jerusalem. But the frenzy is not about football. It's about God and God coming soon. Maybe this Messiah is here in our midst. How will we know?
Over the centuries, the Jews had seen several would-be messiahs come and go. Jesus was not the first. But earlier messiahs had led armed uprisings. Jesus wasn't a military leader. He didn't have any troops. After spending 40 days and nights alone in the wilderness, he returned to Galilee with a plan, which, in its own way, was much more revolutionary than all others. Just 20 miles east of Nazareth, on the great lake known as the Sea of Galilee, Jesus picked his team, the disciples. Instead of recruiting the obvious candidates, like hardened revolutionaries, Jesus picked an unlikely bunch of characters. His first recruit and right-hand man was a fisherman. His name was Simon Peter. A recent discovery here on the shores of the lake has helped archaeologists understand what kind of lives people like Peter lived. In 1985, a severe drought caused the lake to drop to unprecedented levels, revealing an ancient and extraordinary find. next to some 2,000-year-old pottery, archaeologists made one of the great discoveries of modern times. An ancient fishing boat. It was a delicate salvage operation. Each piece of timber was identified with red tape. Then a special foam kept the boat intact and allowed archaeologists to prise it away from the mud. Orna Cohen, the excavation's leader, was astonished to find the boat so well preserved.
Well, that's one of the miracles we've got with this boat. This boat was preserved only because very soon, or at the time it sank, it filled up with silt clay, from a river nearby. This blocked in a very limited oxygen condition and slowed down all the bacterial activity. That's why it's been preserved so well.
While the boat was slowly drying out in a chemical solution, radiocarbon tests were carried out to determine the age of the wood. It was dated to between 40 BC and 40 AD, dates that include the years Jesus lived. The boat was made from assorted second-hand timber and iron nails. Nicknamed the Jesus boat, the relic is now proudly displayed in a museum in Galilee. But could it really have belonged to one of the disciples? Its size certainly is near that of the boat Peter would have used. John's Gospel mentions that Peter's boat could carry at least 7 disciples. This boat is 26 feet long, big enough to carry that number. This is a replica of that first-century boat. It may look like the kind a humble fisherman might be able to afford. But in ancient Galilee, wood was rare, and a boat like this was a luxury. Cohen believes Peter was not a man of humble means.
I can only assume, knowing the condition, that it was considered quite an investment. Whoever owned such a boat was very relatively well-doing person, considered rich.
Jesus also enlisted Peter's brother Andrew and 2 more fishermen, James and John. But Jesus' unusual recruitment drive didn't stop there. He also approached Matthew, a Jewish man employed to collect taxes from the Jews. Then there was Judas, the group's treasurer and the disciple who was to play a key role in the final week of Jesus' life. Jesus underlined his unusual approach by breaking with the tactics used by previous would-be messiahs. Earlier revolutionaries hid in caves or lived on the run. Instead, the Gospels say Jesus and the disciples lived openly in a fishing town called Capernaum, just 5 miles from where the first-century boat was found. On the northern shores of the Sea of Galilee, archaeologists have identified remains of ancient Capernaum. It's become a shrine for pilgrims, a chance for them to recall many of the Gospel stories set there. Archaeologists also believe they may have identified the house of one of the disciples. The tradition in the Middle East has been to preserve sites linked to Jesus by building churches on top of them. When digging started here 100 years ago, they unearthed a series of old churches built around the first-century house. In keeping with this tradition, a modern church was built over the ruins. The new church has proved highly controversial because it obscures the ruins. Mordecai Aviam is one of the leading archaeologists in Galilee. He and many of his colleagues are convinced they know which disciple lived there. On one of the plastered walls, they found graffiti, some as early as the 3rd century AD.
Some of the graffiti, although they are not complete ones, carrying the name of Simon, or the Hebrew name Shimon. So this is St. Peter's Hebrew name. And so we can assume that people that came here knew that this is the house of St. Peter. In a rural area, in a village like this one, families are living for hundreds of years in the same house. So when pilgrims came here, probably in the end of the 2nd or beginning of the 3rd century, and asked natives, do you know where a guy named Shimon, Simon, St. Peter lived? They said, oh yes, of course, this building. You see this building? His grandchildren are living there.
It may be difficult to visualize Peter's house, or indeed Capernaum. But archaeologists believe they now have enough information to recreate what it was like. The size of the excavated area suggests that Capernaum was a town of 1,500 people. No evidence has yet come to light of where Jesus lived. What archaeologists can tell from the foundation is that Peter's house would have been one of several overlooking a common courtyard. So perhaps Jesus and Peter were neighbors. Around the courtyard, people would have continued with their daily tasks, baking bread or carpentry.
Houses were simple, they were large, because those are families that live together. The elders and their sons and daughters and their wives and husbands and their children all live in one large building, as it is in villages nowadays here in Arab villages or other villages in other places in the world.
Women were thought inferior to men at the time. Yet the Gospels say that Jesus included Mary Magdalene and at least 5 other women among his close followers.
He is the only teacher we know of from antiquity who includes women into his group. John talks about him talking with a Samaritan woman. And good gracious alive, are the disciples depressed by this? What is the matter with this man? So he is even different than his followers.
Jesus never married nor had any children. His disciples became his immediate family. They weren't exactly going to bring the Roman army to its knees. But the number of disciples he picked is a clue that Jesus wasn't targeting the Romans. The number 12 was no accident. It harkened back to the 12 tribes who originally founded Israel. People at the time would have understood the symbolism. Scholars believe Jesus was calling for a fresh start. He wanted Israel to go back to the ideals of its founding fathers.
In that world, the Jews of the 1st century, who are just as hungry for justice as people today are, believed passionately that the God of all the world was the God of justice. Therefore, if this God finally did what he promised, they would get justice and peace and mercy. That was what Jesus was basically offering them.
That put Jesus on a collision course, not with the Romans, but with the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem.
And examine the evidence. Knowledge is dangerous. Knowledge is power. An all-new season of Forbidden History starts April 19th at 10, only on AHC.
Deity and headquarters of the Jewish faith was the temple. Jesus had first seen the fabulous gold and marble building when he came to Jerusalem at the age of 12. The temple was run by an aristocratic class of Jewish priests. These are the people with whom Jesus takes issue. Several ancient texts vividly describe their beauties. Every day, at dawn and at dusk, they drew lots to make their sacrifice of pure white lambs to God. The sacrificial blood was then taken into the sanctuary and sprinkled in front of a large curtain. The Jews believed the invisible presence of God dwelt behind it. Every rite, from sacrifice to the burning of incense, was designed to keep the sanctuary pure. But according to the Gospels, Jesus believed the temple had become corrupt.
The temple is not only the place of worship, it's the Jewish treasury, the Jewish bank, it's the Jewish base for authority. And of course, when you have authority, you have the problem of abuse of authority.
Jesus was to become a fierce critic of the temple system. But he wasn't alone. Hanan Ishel, a Hebrew archaeologist, has found in the Dead Sea Scrolls evidence of widespread discontent. The scrolls were the work of a Jewish sect called the Essenes. They walked out of Jerusalem in protest at the power of the temple priests and set up a rival community in Qumran, 20 miles away on the shores of the Dead Sea.
If you needed incense for the altar, then you have to make it. They wouldn't tell it to anybody else in order that that will be bought from their family. And the people in Qumran, in their scroll, they would criticize the priest for keeping those secrets and taking as much money from the temple budget as possible.
It wasn't until archaeologists dug up the streets of Jerusalem that they found evidence of how priests spent their money. In 1967, archaeologists working in what is now the Jewish quarter of the city found enlightening glimpses of the lavish lifestyle enjoyed by the high priests. The area has now been redeveloped, but before that, archaeologists had 14 years in which to excavate. What they found has been preserved under these buildings. The remains of a large first-century house, decorated and furnished in the finest styles of the period. Without doubt, one of the wealthiest households in Jerusalem. It was located near the temple, so it could have belonged to one of the high priests, but there was no direct proof. Then archaeologists found this: a ritual bath used for daily purification. The Jews believed that contact with a corpse, a dead animal, or with bodily fluids such as blood made them ritually unclean. Jesus himself would have had regular ritual baths. Like most Jews, he would have used public facilities. Every town had one. Few people could have afforded their own private ritual bathroom. But this palatial house had several. That could only mean it must have belonged to one of the top priests. To make sure they never mingled with common people, the priests even had a private bridge linking their mansions to the temple. The rest of the people, including Jesus, walked beneath them. But that was only half of the story. There's also evidence that in the time of Jesus, the concern with purity had become an obsession. Wright found that the walls of the original baths had been carefully plastered. Today, only the bare rock and stone walls remain. This ritual bath is just one of more than 100 Wright has found around the Temple Mount perimeter. It was used to purify more than body and soul. Whenever pilgrims came into Jerusalem, They may well have had to use this large bath for their household vessels, utensils, and even for their beds and mattresses.
It was considered in those days like almost mania. Let's imagine the people who gathered here during the festivals, came on pilgrimage, lived here in tents. What would have happened if one bed became impure? Let's say a menstrual woman touched it. It's impure. Somebody coming back from the cemetery and touched it, then they had to purify that particular mattress. This could have been done here.
But no matter how many ritual baths they took, Jewish law stopped some people from going into the temple. The Mishnah, a book listing rules of the times, says that others like the lame, the blind, the sick, the deformed, were all forbidden to enter. These were the people whom Jesus wanted to reach. First on his list were the sick and the infirm. The Gospel of John tells the story of a pool of spring water in a place called Bethesda in Jerusalem. The sick would gather here in the hope of a cure. Occasionally the waters would stir. The sick believed it was a sign that the pool had miraculous powers, and they all rushed to bathe in it. But one paralyzed man could never get to the water in time. When Jesus saw him, he said, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." When the paralyzed man was asked who had healed him, he said he had no idea. Amazing though the stories of such healings are, they have mystified those trying to make sense of Jesus' mission. Did Jesus really have a gift for healing? And how could this possibly help his cause?
Massacre on
Jim of Bass.
This is like CSI Vatican City.
I'm very impressed. That is amazing.
And examine the evidence. Knowledge is dangerous. Knowledge is power. An all-new season of Forbidden History starts April 19th at 10, only on AHC.
The sick and the infirm were a sizable group of outcasts. That's why Jesus was targeting them. It's now known that the setting for the story of the paralyzed man really existed. Although there are no pools called Bethesda in Jerusalem today, archaeologists knew where to look thanks to John's Gospel. He wrote that Bethesda was just outside the sheep gates. The gates were to the north of the city. In that location today is a major archaeological site, with ruins dating back to the time of Jesus. In the 1960s, archaeologists discovered a 1st century temple to Asclepius, the Roman god of healing. They also found a series of small rock pools. Jerry Murphy O'Connor took part in those early excavations, and he's in no doubt that this is the setting for the story of the paralyzed man.
Well, the location that St. John gives in chapter 5 of the Gospel is that it was outside the sheep gates. And the sheep gate in the north wall of the temple was just about 50 meters south of here.
of the sheep gates, the Romans built 2 large pools. Typical Roman baths where ordinary citizens would come and bathe. That was in the daytime. The sick would come out at night. But they headed for a place behind the twin pools, to where the Romans had also built a small temple to Asclepius.
And beneath it would have been a whole series of little baths like this. That is essential to the Asclepius cult. And that's exactly where you'd expect sick people to congregate. That is the context of the miracle story.
Jesus used healing to defy the temple system. On one occasion, after curing a leper, Jesus sends him to the temple priest to make the offerings set by law.
Jesus brought these people back into society, and not only did he bring them back into society, but he challenged the religious notions at that time. People who had the disease, who were cleared of leprosy, Jesus told them to go up to the Temple Mount, something which these people were totally excluded from. It's an unfortunate attitude in antiquity towards people who had any type of illness is that you deserved it. The wages of sin is death. You got sick, you deserved it.
Anybody who can heal in the world without modern medicine is bound to draw large crowds. This may account for Jesus' popularity in Galilee. However subversive, the healings were hardly grounds to have him killed. Something more must have upset the Jewish establishment. These are the ruins of Jerash in Jordan, a Roman city built in the 1st century AD. It was built from the taxes collected in occupied provinces such as Judea. The tax burden under Roman administration was in fact crippling. The money was brought in by Jewish tax collectors. According to historians, in the time of Jesus, the taxman was especially despised.
In any society, and so today, people who go around collecting taxes get a bad press. And we all know that we've got to pay tax, but we don't like the people who come and do it, just like we don't like parking attendants and that sort of thing, because we feel they're an intrusion on our liberty. However, that was compounded by the fact that the taxes were being collected for Rome, and the ordinary Jewish people resented that because they were rich and powerful, and they thought, why should we pay more money to them? They've already got a lot.
Tax collectors not only did the Romans' dirty work, they made matters worse by keeping a cut for themselves. In the eyes of many people, including the religious authorities, this made them outcasts. But Jesus welcomed them. Matthew, for example, one of his disciples was a tax collector. In fact, the Gospels say that Jesus shared meals with all manner of sinners. Sometimes these included prostitutes. They too were despised by the priests because, like tax collectors, they may have been in contact with an impure race, the Romans. As Gentiles, the Romans had not been circumcised like Jews.
A good Jew is not to be seen with a harlot. He's accompanying her. She's with him. And of course, you can imagine the rumors. He goes to the people that are marginalized, not only the tax collectors, but the people who aren't considered important.
Only the temple priests, acting on behalf of God, could forgive sinners. But Jesus shocked everyone by taking matters into his own hands. On one occasion, when Jesus is invited to dinner, a distraught prostitute comes into the house. As the woman wept, her tears fell on his feet. She then wiped the tears away with her hair, covered his feet with kisses, and rubbed them with ointment. When she was finished, Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The Gospels say the priests were outraged. But Jesus replied that he was simply following the Jewish law, which said that you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. Jesus' actions must have rattled the temple priesthood.
Anyone in that world, which is so volatile and politically unstable, anyone who calls together large crowds is bound to be regarded as a threat. When they then, on top of that, see what he's doing and how this is somehow functioning as an overturning of the social world and the normal structures they're used to, then Jesus must have been regarded as a dangerous character.
But Jesus didn't stop there. He also told stories with a deeply unsettling message, and not just for the priests.
These are the stories omitted from the history books.
What is it that the Vatican aren't telling us?
Everything comes unraveled
The ground underneath us now. We're standing in front of it.
when you question the facts.
This is like CSI Vatican City.
I'm very impressed. That is amazing.
And examine the evidence. Knowledge is dangerous. Knowledge is power. An all-new season of Forbidden History starts April 19th at 10, only on AHC.
It's just you and your honey. Setting is perfect. But then erectile dysfunction happens again. Plenty of guys have this issue, not just getting an erection, but keeping it. Well, Viagra helps guys with ED get and keep an erection. And you only take it when you need it.
Ask your doctor if your heart is healthy enough for sex. Do not take Viagra if you take nitrates for chest pain. It may cause an unsafe drop in blood pressure. Side effects include headache, flushing, upset stomach, and abnormal vision. To avoid long-term injury, seek immediate medical help for an erection lasting more than 4 hours. Stop taking Viagra and call your doctor right away if you experience a sudden decrease or loss in vision or hearing.
Ask your doctor if Viagra is right for you.
Your mom's got your back. Your friends have your back. Your dog's definitely got your back. But who's got your back when you need legal help? We do. We're LegalZoom. And over the last 10 years, we've helped millions of people protect their families and run their businesses. We have the right people on hand to answer your questions, backed by a trusted network of attorneys. So visit us today for legal help you can count on. LegalZoom. Legal help is here.
Ameriprise asks people a simple question. Can you keep your lifestyle in retirement?
I don't want to think about the alternative. I don't even know how to answer that. I mean, no one knows how their money's going to last.
I try not to worry, but you worry. What happens when your paycheck stops?
Because everyone has retirement questions, Ameriprise created the exclusive Confident Retirement Approach to get the real answers you need. Start building your confident retirement today.
My lenses have a sunset mode and a partly sunny mode, and an outside to inside mode.
Transitions lenses automatically filter just the right amount of light. Ask for Transition Extra Active Lenses. Extra protection from light. Out.
Behold, we are in the presence of champions. Fantasy sports legends who have earned hundreds of thousands of dollars playing online. Meet Arlie Gonzalez. Average guy, superior sports knowledge. Picked a team in minutes. And won enough to throw the party of a lifetime. In outer space. Former accountant Derek Bradley. DraftKings one-day fantasy golf took him from a guy with holes in his underpants to a guy with bikini models in them. How do we turn our love of fantasy sports into reality cash? DraftKings.com. They have one-day games, so you're not locked in. It's like a new season every time you play. And best of all, you could win a shitload of money. Play daily fantasy golf at DraftKings.com. Use promo code MAJOR to play and get free entry in golf's first major April 9th. Winner gets $1 million. More sports, more winners, more billionaires. Get to DraftKings.com now.
Now,
Sometimes the only way to hunt a monster
One of the best-known stories told by Jesus is the parable of the Good Samaritan. There was once a Jewish man, he began, a traveler who was attacked by a thief and left for dead on the road. One priest saw him and passed him by. Then another priest came his way and also left him. But a passing Samaritan had compassion. He bound up his wounds and took him to an inn. He even left some money with the innkeeper to look after the injured man. Most people think the parable was about helping strangers in need. But in the first century, it would have carried a deeply unsettling message. For the Samaritans weren't strangers, but neighbors. They still are. The descendants of the Samaritans live in Samaria, between Jerusalem and Galilee. This is their annual Passover festival, when they sacrifice 13 lambs, which are then cooked in special pits. The Samaritans and the Jews worship the same God and celebrate some of the same rituals. Long before the time of Jesus, there was a major split, and Jews and Samaritans became enemies. The parable was shocking to them because loving your neighbor also meant loving your enemy.
Jesus was trying to break down barriers that separated people. All these tremendous barriers. Jesus is a barrier breaker. Now, when you attack a barrier, you run into the problem of being destroyed by its collapse.
It was one thing to tell subversive stories from Galilee. Sooner or later, Jesus would have to decide whether to confront the priests in person. First, he refined the message. This is the Mount of the Beatitudes. It's the spot where the Gospels say Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount, his most detailed vision of how he would usher in a new age. Although it's right next to Capernaum, archaeologists can't be sure that this was the right place.
Well, if there was a Sermon on the Mount, it might well have been somewhere in this area, but actually we don't know either of those things, because for a start, Jesus could have come up not just this hill, which is quite a small one, but any of the hills behind where we are or over the other side of the lake, and the chances are he said the same sort of things again and again and again. They didn't have mass media, radio, TV, didn't have any of that, so what Jesus had to do was to say the same things repeatedly so that different people would get the message. Now, it's quite likely that what we have in Matthew's Gospel, which we call the Sermon on the Mount, is undoubtedly an edited and shaped version of some of the sayings that Jesus would have said on that sort of occasion.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of
The
God.
Gospels often mention the big crowd that gathered to hear Jesus speak. But how could they have heard him? After all, there were no loudspeakers.
These wonderful hills are in the contours of a natural amphitheater. We're standing here at the Sea of Galilee in the Bay of Parables, and we have an actor standing over here, and I can hear that actor speaking perfectly from 200 meters away.
One of the most memorable things Jesus said here was the Lord's Prayer. Some of its lines, "Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us," summed up the themes that Jesus was pursuing. The Lord's Prayer is still recited by millions all over the world in dozens of languages. Here, it can still be heard in the language in which Jesus spoke. This little church is in the old city of Jerusalem. When Jesus spoke to his friends or to his disciples, he would have used Aramaic. They don't speak it in Galilee anymore. In fact, like so many ancient languages, it's almost disappeared. Aramaic is still spoken in remote parts of Syria, and in this Syrian Orthodox Church. This is the closest we are ever likely to get to hearing how Jesus spoke. The sound of the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic. It may have been a memorable prayer, but many felt that prayer alone wasn't going to get Jesus very far. So he tackled the question that was on everyone's mind, the use of violence. Jesus was uncompromising. If anyone hits you on the right cheek, he said, offer him the other as well.
Often in the Sermon on the Mount, we come upon sayings which puzzle us initially because it sounds as though Jesus is saying, just be a doormat and let people walk all over you. Turning the other cheek is one example, but that's not what it's all about.
According to Tom Wright, Jesus was using the expression as a metaphor for pacifist or nonviolent resistance.
If I give someone a blow on the right cheek, it'll be with the back of my right hand. And many scholars have suggested that that is a demeaning, dismissive sort of thing to do, which is what you do to a slave or a child or, alas, in that culture, a woman. So that to say, okay, now hit the other cheek is a way of saying, hit me again if you want, but this time do it so that we're equals. It's a way of reaffirming one's own dignity, often with a kind of wry humor at the expense of the bully who's putting you down.
Jesus was breaking new ground. He was letting it be known that he was ruling out the path of violence taken by previous messiahs.
Jesus is saying, if you fight evil with evil, it's always evil that wins, and somehow a different way of conquering evil has to be found.
No leader, no prophet in Jewish history had spoken in such terms. For a year, maybe 3, Jesus traveled the country preaching his radical message. He caused even more outrage by taking it to Gentiles. On one occasion, in his adopted town of Capernaum, a Roman officer asked him to heal a servant who was severely ill. This was a big test. The Messiah was only supposed to come and save the Jews. But once again, Jesus overturned the expectations and healed the servant.
For Jesus to go to the house of a Gentile or to do something in relation to a Gentile would have been like Jesus going to eat with a sinner or whoever. It would be a sign that he was breaking through normal barriers.
But if that's all it took to right the wrongs he saw in Jewish society, then Jesus could have stayed here in Galilee healing the sick and telling stories. Instead, the Gospels say that Jesus decides to make a stand once and for all. He told his disciples that there was no time to lose. They had to leave their possessions, their boats, even their families, and follow him. They made their way from Galilee to Jerusalem to confront the temple priests. As they journeyed down, the disciples may well have wondered how on earth Jesus was going to do it. So far, Jesus had used the symbolic power of healing and parables to undermine their authority. But that was in the relative safety of Galilee. His actions show that Jesus planned to press on with his symbolic protests, only this time under the very noses of the temple priests.
Who do you think is the
My goal.
Much like religious Jews today, first-century Jews were steeped in the sayings and prophecies of their ancient scriptures. And everyone knew that some of them foretold the coming of God and the Messiah. They even spelled out how the arrival of God could be recognized. His arrival would be heralded by a Messiah entering the city on a donkey.
Riding on a donkey comes from the prophet Zechariah, which speaks of a king who will come as a man of peace rather than as a man of war. And there are other prophecies which speak about him coming through this east gate.
Scholars say that Jesus decided to throw down the gauntlet and challenge the priests by entering the holy city in the way spoken by the prophecies. If Jesus had walked into Jerusalem, no one would have batted an eye. But Jesus makes a point of riding in through the fabled East Gate.
There are several prophecies that Jesus seems deliberately to be picking up and echoing, and it appears that Jesus was consciously acting out God's judgment on the city and the temple system that was refusing his message.
The priests would have been outraged. Who did Jesus think he was? The Messiah? God himself? They would soon find out. Jesus couldn't have picked a more dangerous week to enter Jerusalem. The Gospels say that he arrived in time for Passover, the festival when Jews to this day remember the flight of the Hebrews from Egypt. Helen Bond, an expert on the politics of the period, believes Jesus' timing was deliberate.
Thousands of people were converging on Jerusalem and flocking into this tiny, tiny city, all heaving together inside the walls. It was a very, very tense time, and the whole city, I think, would have been like an immense tinderbox, that it just needed one spark, and that was it.
The Roman governor in charge of Judea at the time was based 60 miles away in Caesarea. His name was Pontius Pilate. He would also have had to make the trip to Jerusalem, albeit reluctantly.
He would have had to leave his nice, pleasant, cool villa at Caesarea, full of all the pagan Gentile things that he was used to, and he'd had to make the journey with a fairly sizable amount of troops down to Jerusalem. The feast attracted so many different people from all over the empire that there was a worry from the Roman point of view that there could be riots and insurrections.
It wasn't a good time to have rebels and would-be saviors kicking up a fuss. Yet that's precisely what Jesus sets about doing. On the afternoon of his arrival, the Gospels say that Jesus went around looking at everything in the temple area. He would have gone up these steps and through a double door just here on the southern wall. A long tunnel led from the southern gate towards the money changers' courtyard. That day, Jesus would have seen the evils he had denounced time and time again going on in the heart of the temple. Pilgrims had to change their impure currency for pure temple coins. The coins were used to buy blemish-free white doves to sacrifice to God. The permanently impure, such as the sick, were kept out by guards. The next day, Jesus went back.
think a lot of people, when they read the story about Jesus and the money changers, think that it's just like having a shop in a cathedral or something like that, and they think, oh, this is terrible, having commerce on this sacred turf. But actually, this is a calculated act. It's like somebody deliberately going into the main square of the capital city in Washington or London or wherever and burning the flag. It's a way of saying this system is under God's judgment, and people, I'm sure, would have heard it like that.
Everyone, including Jesus, knew that the temple priests wouldn't tolerate any more insults. Pontius Pilate, too, would have been alerted to the disturbance. What was Jesus thinking?
It couldn't be ignored. For pilgrims who come for the first time in their lifetime to Jerusalem, and they come with some kind of leader from the Galilee, and that's what the leader does. They will talk about this. And that's exactly what the priest didn't want it to happen.
Everything Jesus had done so far, the healing, the parables, the provocative entry into Jerusalem, would have won him more support, but equally it would have gotten him deeper into trouble. A confrontation with the temple priests was looming. The outcome of that encounter would decide the fate of his mission. In the days before his death, Jesus of Nazareth began deliberately provoking his enemies. Until now, scholars have wondered why. New scientific and historical evidence sheds light on the life of Jesus and the crucial hours before his death. And for the first time, scientists put a human face on a man more than 1 billion people believe to be the Son of God. Every year, Christians around the world commemorate the death of Jesus. Here in Jerusalem, pilgrims reenact the last hours of his life by carrying a cross to the place of his execution. The crucifixion is one of the best attested facts in history. Not only is it mentioned in the Bible more than 80 times, it was also recorded by the first-century historian Josephus. But the actions of Jesus in the 24 hours before his death remain clouded in mystery. He had many chances to avoid execution, yet he never took them.